Penultimate. It's a word that you don't use over here in Canada, isn't it? But we are in the penultimate week, which means the last but one week in British terms, of our series in the Psalms here, our summer playlist series. And we've spent the last 2 months really looking through some of the different Psalms. If you want to catch up on any of that, it's all available on our website, Numa.Church, or on YouTube, on our channel. And would encourage you just to go back and look over any of those, particularly if they've spoken to you, if they've encouraged you, or if you're just curious about some that you missed, go and take a look at those. This morning we're going to pick up on Psalm 62. And if you've got a Bible with you, whether it's paper or digital, I want to encourage you to turn there with me so that you can follow along as we look at it. Now, typically, I start with some kind of connection point before diving into the text. This morning, I want to dive straight into the text because what I want to do this morning is find the context of the psalm and then try and relate that back to us. And then we're going to look at some more of the psalm around it. So we're going to jump straight into Psalm 62. The opening words read, "For Jeduthun, the choir director, a psalm of David." I'm going to be working from the New Living Translation this morning, just for a bit of context. So the New Living Translation puts it in this particular order, which is different to the others. But "For Jeduthun, the choir director, a psalm of David." So the reason I'm picking up on this, even though it's not part of the main part of the psalm, is because this immediately gives us a little bit of the context of when the psalm was written and why the psalm was written. So first of all, it finds its place in a corporate gathered worship setting. Jeduthun, we're told here, was a choir director, and you can find him in 1 Chronicles, I think it's 16 and 25, where it makes mention that King David, so we also know that this therefore was written at the time that David was king, appointed Jeduthun and some others as kind of the music directors, the choir directors over the worship within the tabernacle. And so this is designed, it's intended, it is written for a corporate gathered setting of worship. And we're in a corporate gathered setting of worship. So it's kind of appropriate for us to look at it. And again, as I just mentioned, we know that David was king at the time because we know it was for Jeduthun, and we're told it was a Psalm of David, so we know that it was David that wrote it. We're going to take a look at verses 3 and 4, because they're the ones that give us some of the context of what David was going through when he wrote it. So let's just jump straight to verse 3. David writes this: "So many enemies against one man," meaning himself, "all of them trying to kill me. To them, I'm just a broken down wall or a tottering fence. They plan to topple me from my high position. They delight in telling lies about me. They praise me to my face, but they curse me in their hearts." Okay, so this is some of what David is going through. He's facing multiple enemies. They're trying to kill him. They're planning to topple him from his place as king. They're spreading lies about him, and they're being completely two-faced, praising him to his face, cursing him behind his back. Okay, so we've got some context. Let's bring this back home to us now. Why is this psalm relevant to us when it was written all those years ago for David going through that? Let me ask this question. How many of you are facing a death threat? Okay, that was kind of what I expected. How many of you are in a position of power where you've got people trying to usurp you from that position? Okay, also blank. Again, it might make us ask the question, okay, so why is this psalm relevant? How does this psalm speak to us? Right, because most of us are not facing death threats and coup d'etat. That's kind of something that's reserved for leading politicians. But how can we relate to this psalm? I want to suggest this. Even if we haven't faced death threats, even if we're not facing death threats, even if we've not faced this situation of being under threat of our position that has been God appointed for David being taken from us, and we've got people against us. Well, some of us do know what it's like to have people tell lies about us. Some of us do know what it's like to have people around us who are a little bit two-faced, who might kind of be kind to us, to our face, speak nicely to us, but then they're saying other things about us behind our back. Some of us do recognize that. So perhaps we can relate to some of the specifics, even if we can't relate to all of the specifics of what David was going through. But I want to suggest this. If we take it more generally, If we take David's situation more generally and we begin to look at some of the other vocabulary that he puts around this specific situation, we actually see that primarily what David is talking about is a situation where his life was being shaken. Literally, the last words of verse 2 before that, he talks about never being shaken. So this psalm is about finding yourself in a place where the stuff that is going on around you, the situation you find yourself in, the way that people around you are treating you or speaking about you leaves you feeling shaken. How many of us can relate to that? None of you are claiming you can. I'm going to put my hand up. I know what it is like for life to be shaken by things that are going on, by circumstances I found myself in, by the way that people around me have treated me or spoken about me. I think we do know what it feels like to have the deck stacked against us, as it were. We do know what it is like for our life to feel shaken. We do know what it is like for people to mistreat us. And I want to suggest that if we relate to any of that, then we can relate to this psalm and we can relate to what David has to say. And specifically, as we look at this psalm, I want to suggest that what we can learn from it is that when we feel that our life is being shaken, when we feel that we've got stuff going on around us, that we're in the middle of circumstances that threaten to shake us, or we've got people around us mistreating us or speaking badly about us, that actually there's a way that David responds and learnt to respond that we can learn from as well. And that's what I want to help us try and dig into today. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to dive into the rest of the psalm, okay? Father God, I want to thank you that even though sometimes we can look at your word and go, I just don't quite get how that relates to me, that actually there are principles that are there, that are underlying it, that we can learn from. And God, for each of us, we know that life is not safe and secure all the time. We know there are times that we feel shaken. We know there are times, God. We've walked through times, perhaps we're walking through times now, where life just doesn't seem to be treating us fairly. And so I want to ask, Father, that as we look at this psalm together this morning, you would help us to learn how not to be shaken, as David learnt not to be shaken. Help us find our strength and our peace and our hope in you as we look at this word together. Amen. Okay, so we're going to go back to the very beginning of the psalm now, to verse 1. We're going to read verses 1 and 2, and then we're going to read verses 5 to 7, because they kind of echo those first two verses, and I want to look at that together, okay? So verses 1 and 2, first of all. I wait quietly before God, for my victory comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, where I will never be shaken. Down to verse 5. Let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, where I will not be shaken. My victory and my honor come from God alone. He is my refuge, a rock where no enemy can reach me. If verses 3 and 4 gave us the context of what David was going through, if they gave us the circumstances and the challenge that David was facing, I want to suggest that these verses 1 and 2 and verses 5 to 7, that kind of are either side of the context, give us what I'm going to call the counter. They give us David's counter response to the context. They give us his counter response to the challenge. They give us the counter response to the circumstances. And framing the situation that David is facing, verses 5 and 6 echo verses 1 and 2. And David repeats, I will never be shaken, I will not be shaken. So how is it that David, in the midst of that situation that he was in, where his life was under threat, his position was under threat, his reputation was under threat, his relationships were under threat, how is it in that situation he can say, I will never be shaken? Where did he find his confidence? Well, David's counter to the circumstances is this: I wait quietly before God. He says it twice. First in verse 1, as a statement of what he does, I wait quietly before God. And then again in verse 5, but this time almost as an encouragement or an instruction to himself. Let all that I am wait quietly before God. So what does that look like? In another verse in the Bible, Isaiah 40, verse 31, God speaks through the prophet Isaiah and says this: those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. Now, in that verse, which you may be familiar with, where it says, those who wait on the Lord, wait is the Hebrew word kavah, which means to wait actively. So it doesn't mean to stop and wait. It just means you wait, but you wait with an anticipation. You wait with an expectation that God is going to move on your behalf, that you're okay. And in that active waiting, God renews your strength. And you can have in that an expectant hope for God to move. But in these verses in Psalm 62, wait is a different Hebrew word, which I struggle to pronounce, but it's something like damiyah. And that's not an active, expectant, anticipatory waiting. It is literally silence. Stop. Wait quietly. In silence. And just sit before God. When your life is shaken, it's not always the time to dig in and dig deep and just push through. Sometimes when your life is shaken, you just need to stop and wait quietly before God. And in that silent waiting before God, He will breathe new hope, new strength, new peace as you just surrender to Him and you wait on Him, saying, I'm not going to try and do this in my own strength anymore. I can't do this in my own strength anymore. And so, God, I sit and I wait quietly before you just to receive from you. That's what David is talking about. Excuse me. There's another psalm, Psalm 46, was written in a time of trouble and war. And in that psalm, which is written kind of prophetically, God says this: be still and know that I am God. The meaning in that situation, in the midst of trouble and war, was don't fear, don't panic. Come before me. Recognize that I am God. And it's okay. I've got you. It's that kind of thing that David is talking about here in Psalm 62. And Psalm 46 begins with this statement of confidence: God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. That's the kind of confidence that David had when he talks about waiting quietly before God. God is my refuge. God is my strength. God is my ever-present help in times of trouble. And I will never be shaken, regardless what this life throws at me, regardless what this world throws at me. I will not be shaken because I wait quietly before God. And when we do that in that quiet place, that's when God speaks peace to our soul. It's when he brings peace to our minds. It's when he gives us the strength that we need to walk through what we find ourselves in. And David repeats this idea of waiting quietly before God twice, and each time he gives a reason to wait quietly before God. In verse 1, I wait quietly before God because my victory, literally my salvation, comes from him. So I wait quietly before God because that's where my salvation comes from, not anywhere else. So I'm going to sit and wait quietly before the source of my salvation. Verse 5. Let all that I am wait quietly before God, because my hope is in him. So I'm not going to put my hope in anything else, but I'm going to sit and wait quietly before God because he's the source of my hope. My hope is in him. My salvation is in him. So when we're at risk of being shaken, I want to suggest that our counter response is this: wait quietly before God. Know that he is your salvation. Know that he is your hope. Be still. Know that he is God. David actually says it repeatedly throughout this psalm. And I just want to go back to that original context. This was written for a choir to sing in a corporate gathered worship setting. That in that place of worship, these declarations would be made. God is, verse 1, our victory, our salvation. God is, verse 2, our rock, our fortress. Verse 5, God is our hope. Verse 6, God is our rock, our salvation, our fortress again. Verse 7, God is our refuge, our rock. Verse 8, God is our refuge. Can you imagine opening a hymn book, as it were, and time and again and being led in worship with songs that are declaring and reminding you, God is your refuge. God is your rock. God is your salvation. It's why we sing the songs that we do, not just because it's nice to start a service by singing some songs together, but because it is good to come and proclaim the truth of God and worship him and recognize him for who he is. And so we have the context, we have this counter response, and then in verse 8 we have the call. O my people, trust in him at all times. Pour out your heart to him, for God is our refuge. That confidence, that conviction that God is our refuge means that whatever you're facing, whatever you're walking through, and however you're feeling in the midst of that, however much faith you have in that moment, however little faith you have in that moment, the call is simply this: trust in God at all times. David has learned in the midst of the worst circumstances to trust God. When his life is hanging in the balance, his position is hanging in the balance, his reputation is hanging in the balance, his relationships with those around him hangs in the balance. His circumstances could leave him shaken, but he stands confident in the knowledge that God is his salvation, God is his rock, God is his fortress, God is his hope, God is his refuge, God is his strength. And so he writes this song for his people, saying this in verse 8, my people, trust in him, trust in God at all times. Trusting God is more than a statement to be put on banknotes. It's more than a statement to be put on a meme on social media. It's more than a statement for me to simply preach from a pulpit. I want to suggest that trust in God, trust in him, is a mission-critical strategy for life. This is how to get through life. Trust in him at all times. People will let us down. People will fail us. People will betray us. People might lie about us. People might be two-faced to us. But God is faithful. He is trustworthy. And you may have had people you thought that you could trust, and they've let you down. You may have had people who have been in positions where you should have been able to trust them, and they failed you. God can be trusted. So I want to give you kind of a bottom line, a statement that if you take only one thing away with you today, it's this: trust God alone and trust God always. That's what I want you to grab hold of today. Trust God alone and trust God always. So we've been looking at the New Living Translation because I just found that some of its phraseology is a bit easier to grab hold of in this psalm. But a more literal translation of the original Hebrew says this, verse 1, for God alone my soul waits in silence. Verse 2, he only is my rock and my salvation. Verse 5, repeating verse 1, for God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. Verse 6, he only is my rock and my salvation. The New Living Translation actually picks it up in verse 7. My victory and my honor come from God alone. Trust God alone. Don't start putting your trust in other things. God is the one you can trust. God is the one who will not let you down. He is the one who will not fail you. We sang that in that final song. Your love never fails, never lets go. So know that God alone is your salvation. Don't look anywhere else or to anyone else or to anything else to be your salvation. Trust God alone. He alone is your rock. So don't rely on anyone else to be a rock for you. Don't rely on anything else to be a rock for you, because people can let us down. The things of this world, material things, fail us. It's good to have people around us to support us and encourage us, so don't mishear me on this. I'm not saying we should just kind of all completely isolate ourselves and go, it's just me and you, God, and I don't want to see anyone else around here. I don't need anyone else. That's not what God's designed for us. He's designed for us to be in relationship. He's designed for us to be in community. He's designed for us to be family together, loving and supporting and encouraging one another, building one another up, spurring one another on, honoring one another. All of these things are instructions that we're given in the scriptures. But let's not lean on other people and make them more important than God. Lean on God, make him your rock. He is the rock to build our lives on. David actually says as much in verses 9 and 10. Common people are as worthless as a puff of wind. The powerful are not what they appear to be. If you weigh them on the scales, together they're lighter than a breath of air. Verse 10, don't make your living by extortion. Don't put your hope in stealing. If your wealth increases, don't make it the center of your life. So verse 9 is commenting on people. Verse 10 is commenting on material things. David's basically setting up this contrast. He says, trust God alone. Because people can't always be trusted and things can't always be trusted. So trust God alone. Don't make people or things your rock. Don't make people or things your salvation. Trust God alone. And that second part of what I want you to remember is to trust God always. David writes, "Oh, my people, trust in him at all times." So trust him in the good, and definitely trust him in the bad. Trust him when it's easy. And I want to suggest when you learn to trust him in the easy, that will actually help you to trust him when it's hard. Trust him when you see a way through things. Trust him when you don't see a way through things. Trust him when you're full of hope. And trust him when you have doubts and things feel hopeless. Trust him at all times. Trust God always. Why? Very simply, David says this back in verse 8, "For God is our refuge." He's a refuge. He's a shelter, so that when the earth is shaken, when our life is shaken, we can go to him, hide ourselves in him, find our refuge in him, and trust him. We're going to wrap this up in a moment with a look at verses 11 and 12. But very quickly, I don't want you to miss this invitation. So there's a call in verse 8, trust in him at all times. But then there's this invitation, pour out your heart to him. In those moments where you feel shaken or when you feel like you've been dealt an unfair hand, moments of struggle and strife, of hurt and hardship, moments where you've been betrayed, pour out your heart to him. That's what David says. I love this. I love how the God that we worship, the Almighty One, the Holy One, the Sovereign One, our salvation, our stronghold, our fortress, our rock, our rescuer, our redeemer, our refuge, is not only big enough and mighty enough to be trusted with the worst and darkest of situations, but he's loving and compassionate enough to be trusted with the worst and darkest and most hopeless and doubtful of our thoughts and feelings. Pour out your heart to him. If you were here a few weeks ago, we had Pastor Todd Lewick come and speak, and he said, Jesus can handle the unfiltered me. I love that. Peter writes to the early church, give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. I love how that's paraphrased in the Passion Translation. Pour out all your worries and stress upon him and leave them there. For he always tenderly cares for you. Pour out your heart to him, David writes. It's an invitation to get real with him. It's an invitation to trust God not only with our circumstances, but also to trust him with what we're feeling. To trust him with the state of our hearts. So trust God alone. Trust God always. Let's wrap it up with a look at verses 11 and 12. God has spoken plainly, and I have heard it many times. Power, O God, belongs to you. Unfailing love, O Lord, is yours. Surely you repay all people according to what they've done. So having written about how we can trust God by waiting quietly before him to receive his strength and his peace, and why we can trust God, because he's our rock and our salvation, he's our refuge, and he's the very source of hope, David ends with two further reasons why we can trust God. Firstly, power belongs to him. Secondly, he's a God of unfailing love. So whoever you are, whatever you have done, however you feel about yourself, whatever you have walked through, whatever you have experienced, there's probably people who love you, but no one loves you like God does. God's love for you is unfailing. God's love for you is unconditional. God's love, as I actually prayed earlier, covers a multitude of sin. Unfailing love, O Lord, is yours, David writes. So because his love for you is unfailing, you can trust him. But you can also trust him because the power belongs to him. He is the Almighty One. He is the one who spoke the universe into existence. He's the one who puts breath in our lungs every day. He's the one whom angels and seraphim worship in heaven. He's the one who conquered death, defeated the grave. He heals the lame, gives sight to the blind. He cures cancer. He heals broken bones. He's the one who restores relationships and works justice. The power belongs to him, so you can trust him. His love for you is unfailing, so you can trust him. And the power belongs to him. You can trust him. So trust God alone and trust God always.